Of course, that's a committee set up by Cabinet to examine statues, monuments, and other historical signage in Trinidad and Tobago. We had 26 people voting on the poll this morning. 19 of you said yes, and 7 of you said no. Of course, you can continue to vote on this poll throughout the day through all programming, and we'll give you the final results tomorrow morning.
That's right.
Which will be Friday, believe it or not. We are already at the weekend.
All right. I'm not seeing you guys, and I need to hear from Dorothy. So good morning, Dorothy. Where is Dorothy?
Recording in progress.
There's Dorothy, unseen co-host on our morning show. Good morning, Shabaka. What's happening?
Good morning, Steve.
You all right?
Yes, indeed.
Man, I look at you and Richard, and you all in black. You all didn't let me know this morning. I could have worn black. They say black is make you look slim.
Yeah. Well, that's why I dressed in black. I don't know about Richard.
If you have enough black in it, you look slim, Steve. Can you get a really picture like you look slim with black?
Well, good morning, Shabaka, and welcome to the Power Breakfast Show.
Power breakfast, all right.
Morning, Shabaka. How are you?
Good, Paul.
Of course, we're talking the committee that was set up by Cabinet, and of course, our poll this morning is actually in reference to a quote that is from you, as indicated in the newspapers, with regard to the representation of Indo and Afro-Trinidadian civil society groups on the committee. Could you explain? I'm assuming that this is a correct quote. Let me start off by saying that. And so if you could give some context in why you think that representation should be on the committee in a more empathetic way.
I don't know, Paul, but Richard, but let me if you have let me start off by saying that if you have what we have right now is indigenous civil society represented on the committee, but you don't have an explicitly African or Indian civil society represented on the committee. I think that could be problematic. I also think, and I have received a number of calls now from indigenous members of the indigenous community of Trinidad and Tobago who are dissatisfied with their own representative on that committee. That is Chief Ricardo Barath. That's because he has been a radical outlier in terms of his perspective on the removal of Christopher Columbus, and not just a radical outlier in the national community, a radical outlier in his own community, and a radical outlier in the hemispheric indigenous community. And so the reports I'm getting is that indigenous people, not just in Trinidad and Tobago, but up the islands as well, are dissatisfied with his appointment because of his radical stance where their community is concerned. They have been the leaders since the 1970s in calls to end the open glorification of Christopher Columbus. In fact, I think the year was 1977, the very first time indigenous people had a voice on the international stage at the level of the UN. They called for the removal of Christopher Columbus from places of open of public veneration. And so Ricardo Barath stands in stark contrast to the views of his community. And last night, somebody called into my radio show to tell me that even in Irima, in his own community, they don't think he'd be able to find 3 people who would agree with him. And so that is problematic, that somebody who is so openly partisan on the issue would be invited. But of course, for me, I always believe in inclusion. And I think the whole premise of the project is that I wanted our people to be able to look at Port of Spain differently, to see their values represented and to see themselves represented. I don't want Port of Spain. Some people would have accused me of trying to to change the streets names and the people who are honored to African people or any other. It needs to be inclusive. All the people of Trinidad and Tobago need to see themselves, and I think the committee, as a starting point, should start in that way. So
let's talk. Actually, let's talk about that, Shabaka, because when we did a poll yesterday, and our poll yesterday, I believe, was on Picton specifically.
Yes.
And whether he should be removed, and all indications of him removed across Trinidad and Tobago. And while the majority said yes, there was a sizable minority that said no. And some of the explanations when people voted no was that they felt that history, I'm paraphrasing them, and my apologies to the listeners if I'm paraphrasing you wrong, but I think they were saying, some of them were saying, well, he is part of our history, and even though it's an ugly part, it's still something that we need to discuss. So they're saying contextualize it in terms of who he was, what he did, but don't erase it because it's part of the history. A version of that. At least some of them said that. Some of them didn't give any explanation. They just said no, they don't think there was the name. They just voted on the poll no. They don't think his name should be removed. I don't, and I'm sure this explanation or this argument has cropped up from time to time with you and on this journey, which is a pretty long journey that you're on in terms to get all of these things rectified, where people say, well, it's part of the historical narrative, and how do you balance that in terms of obliterating it, because you can't obliterate history.
Okay, so I'm not surprised if there is some minority, and I know it's the minority, but I'm not surprised that there's a minority that would feel strongly against this type of activity. We in the Caribbean are victims of colonial epistemic violence. We usually think of the other kinds of violence, the violence of genocide, slavery, indentureship, and the apartheid system that we live between emancipation and independence. We think in terms of that kind of violence, but what we don't realize is we're also victims of epistemic violence. And so the colonials did not want us to come into a knowledge, into contact with the violence that they committed in any visible, tangible, or educational way. And so when people say they don't want to move Picton, they don't want to move the Picton that is inside their imagination, that was implanted in their imagination. The actual Picton, the character who lived upon this earth, who was the first British governor of Trinidad and Tobago, they don't know who he is or what he did. I know that for a fact. None of the narratives I've seen anywhere so far, including those coming out of the United Kingdom, that are all pro-removal, actually give a full context of the villain that Picton was in Trinidad and Tobago. So knowledge is really important. And in fact, the monuments that we see in our public spaces are part of the miseducation, are part of the colonial epistemic violence. When they left the Caribbean in 1962, 80% of the people here were functionally illiterate and therefore could not access epistemic violence through their textbooks. So they used Empire Day, Columbus Day, all the streets, all the things, so to put their narrative in front of people. And of course, that narrative in a nutshell is that slavery in Trinidad was short and benign, and we were all one family thereafter. It was one love between 1838 and 1962. Totally, patently false.
How does one, Shabaka, what benchmark do you think is going to be employed by such a committee? Looking at the history of slavery, African slavery, the history of indentureship, because the indentured workers were also treated badly. In terms of the atrocities that were committed, those men, and in some cases women, were creatures of their time and what was status quo at the time. Unfortunately, slavery was legal at that time, and the crown colonies, the colonizers, brought the slaves here, in some cases, in some jurisdictions, eradicated entire populations. If you look at North America, for instance, what happened to the Native Indians? What is the benchmark that should be used for what level of atrocity would rise to the occasion of removal of that individual's name from not only in Port of Spain, you mentioned Port of Spain, but certainly all over the country, the atrocities would have occurred because they have streets of similar names in San Fernando, etc. When the community starts to deliberate.
So, Paul, it's not about what they did in their time, but what what values we proclaim in our time. So, and this is the consensus across the world. So, for example, in Spain, and I want to single out Spain because Spain has that country through their ambassador has been working against the efforts to remove Columbus, not just in Trinidad and Tobago, but across the Caribbean. But that country, while they were doing that, they were removing all monuments to a man called General Franco. And they simply said, according to the Spanish premier at the time, that honoring someone who was a dictator who caused the deaths of so many people was incompatible with their democracy. And I think we need to have a similar standard. Who is it that we revere today that is incompatible with the values we want for our future? We have a society that is among the most violent societies in the world when it comes to crime, homicidal crime. According per capita, we are in the top 20 countries in the world, perhaps in the top 10. I have to look at the latest statistics in terms of the homicide rates per capita. And so we would want to project a set of values that would move us beyond that state and celebrating colonial criminals who were the icons of the genocide of the native people, of enslavement of native people and Africans, of indentureship of Indians, and the apartheid, and I use the word apartheid, knowing the word very clearly, it's becoming more and more the language that CARICOM is using to describe the period between emancipation and present. The icons of that period are the ones who were celebrated by colonialism because that was the value system of colonialism. The people who, and some people think it's a racial thing. It's not. There were white people during the colonial period who stood up against those values in that period. And they, like the African and Indian and other Portuguese, etc., Chinese heroes, they were buried in the dustbin of history as well. And so I think the question is not about what they did in the past, but about how they are, about what we value today. Those are the, you revere, you celebrate, and you glorify people and values that you believe in. And so that's going to be, that has to be the benchmark. Of course, Picton was in his own time considered to be the tyrant of Trinidad and the blood-stained governor. He was tried at King's Bench in the UK and found guilty for torturing a 14-year-old girl here in Trinidad and Tobago. Of course, she was considered to be a citizen of empire. She was a free-colored person. He was not tried for the crimes he committed against African ancestors who were on the plantations because they weren't considered human beings at the time. In the case of somebody like, let's say, Churchill, Winston Churchill from the Churchill and Roosevelt Highway, I see that Professor Emeritus Bridget Brereton has already stated publicly that she would be opposed to removing his name from the highway. I think there are some Indian brothers and sisters in this country who would disagree. He is now considered one of the unsung mass murderers of the 20th century. In his own time, he was compared to Hitler by members of his own cabinet, and he's responsible for the murder or the deaths of over 3 million Indians. He even stated he was such an arch racist that Indians were a beastly people with a beastly religion. I'm not sure. I certainly wouldn't want to continue to glorify someone like that. And of course, I could go one step further and tell you that even in the UK itself, that is in the United Kingdom, university campuses that have named buildings after Churchill are debating whether or not they should continue to honor him. So I think we need to be open to having an honest discussion about his character and about whether we feel that it is okay for us to continue to honor somebody like that.
Were you, I mean, in terms of this committee that was that is set up by cabinet, I mean, it seemed to me that you were an obvious choice to be on the committee simply because you have been such a vocal advocate of this issue for so many years. Did it surprise you that you were not on the committee, or it doesn't surprise you when it comes to political appointments and things like that?
I have to say, everything surprises me about how things happen here, because of course we petitioned Parliament in July 2020 to establish this committee to identify, destroy, repurpose, or reconstitute monuments, memorials, emblems, signs, symbols, and the like that celebrate, commemorate, and glorify racism and white supremacy. We petitioned. That petition was read by a member of the government in the House, and it passed without objection. So, we have championed this since 2017. How strange is that we would not be, or we'd be excluded from such a committee? Now, there's still a possibility, according to some of the things that have been said to us, that that could change. But what is the likelihood of it? And of course, why would if you have a school feeding program and somebody's advocated for school feeding, would it be strange that you're setting it up and you set up a commission to look into it and leave out the person who's been advocating for school feeding? That seems a bit odd. And I think that the various entities across the society are going to begin to wade in on that over the next couple of weeks as this thing begins to move forward.
How important is also the aspect, because a lot of what your advocacy has been about is actually identifying the miseducation and correcting the misinformation. And part of what to me should be, I think, has been advocated by yourself and others, is the educational aspect of this, because a lot of Trinidadians and Tobagonians and visitors really don't know the history as accurately as should be accurately told. So is it that part of this project or this movement is to ensure that the education system now is reorganized, especially in terms of Caribbean history, to reflect the accuracies of these people who will now become removed as persons who are the words and statues, and also to tell the stories of the Caribbean heroes and the Trinidadian heroes who have built the country.
Yeah, I think we have stated explicitly from the very onset that the monuments and symbols really sat on a narrative that was in our children's textbooks, that was in itself disgraceful and erroneous. And the best example I could give you is the Christopher Columbus hero narrative, the hagiography around Christopher Columbus, which is a ritual that all children from the age of about 7 across the Caribbean must participate in. Of course, it is a primer for them to understand and to accept the status quo that they live in, that society of white over brown over black, the idea that it is okay for the powerful to rule over and exploit the weak, that there's some kind of divine sanction for this. All that is in that Columbus hero narrative that they feed our children as their first lesson in history across the Caribbean. So we've always been very clear about that. And as I said, I think that the reason we're having this committee today is because of the tireless work that we've done, the research that we've done to demonstrating that we have the capacity to engage the national population, to educate, to share the information, to dig in the archives, to find the secrets, the truths. And so it really would be a shame if indeed we were not invited to participate in such a committee.
What do you think is resonating now? I've been discussing this with you for over almost 15 years. Why do you think it's actually resonating now or resonated now?
Well, for the same reason that is resonating all across the world. The idea of people becoming, and I think let's deal with the Trinidadian situation for a second. During the period of Eric Williams's rule, he set up a committee to look in this, very same committee, somewhere in the late 70s, run by a Dr. C.V. Gocking. Of course, that work was unfinished. When we went to the University of West Indies and we started what we thought was original work with the removal of the name of Alfred Milner, we discovered that Eric Williams had pioneered that work. And in fact, he was planning to remove Alfred Milner while he was alive. And the only reason that he didn't do it was because Lady Alice was the chancellor at the time, and her family was friends with the Milner family. And by the way, Milner's descendants fly into Trinidad every so often, and they lime in Woodbrook and think people don't know that. But he felt that it would embarrass her at the time. But Williams was absolutely certain about the fact that we would have to look critically at the names and values that were celebrated in our public places. I am sure if he were alive today, he'd be shocked to know that leader after leader after his time of his own party didn't see it fit to do the necessary. And so what makes this particular moment so important is the same thing that made the 70s so important. The Black Lives Matter movement, which brought into clear relief the issues of race and racism. And it brought to the fore the idea, the understanding that the way the world was set up, certain people of color didn't have the same, their lives didn't have the same value as others. And so once you revalue, once you reevaluate the lives of people of color, and you put it on the same level as other people, then the same rules apply. So the consensus across the world is if you kill X amount of millions of people, you cannot be honored in a public space. In the case of Hitler, as an example, there are many monuments to Hitler, many of them designed by a British artist called Arnold Brecker. They're all put away in a warehouse in Germany. They are not fit for public display because the Jews are human beings and Hitler did his crimes to human beings. The reason that Columbus remains standing in many parts of the Caribbean, and let me say that many of his statues have been removed all across the hemisphere. I don't know what makes the Caribbean such an outlier. The reason that his statues, because we still don't acknowledge the full humanity of indigenous people in the region. If you look at our textbooks and the way we talk about them, it is as if they're not quite on par with the rest of humanity. They don't have full humanity in the narrative. And that's why it's okay for us to celebrate the man who initiated the genocide and enslavement of that people. The same goes for people of African descent. When we talk about somebody who practiced slavery and trafficking our ancestors, we often say, but that's just a little slavery. We don't fully comprehend that we're talking about human beings, hundreds and thousands and millions of human beings who lived in the most odious of criminal enterprises, and we can't grasp that. We're not taught to grasp that. And we're not taught that they are actual human beings. So wherever you find that Black life has been revalued and put on par with white life, it naturally follows that the people who committed crimes against Black life would immediately come into question.
In terms of the monuments and street signs, of course, we would have touched on Thomas Picton, we would have touched on Christopher Columbus. What are the major other monuments and or street names or figures we are celebrating that you have a concern with, that you think should be removed?
Well, again, the way that colonialism operated is that it honored, the value system of colonialism meant that they honored the icons of their great crimes. And so they would have honored the icon of native genocide, the icons of enslavement, the icons of indentureship and apartheid, the people who practiced those things at the highest level. And so we're going to find that when we begin to lift the lid on a lot of the people who are celebrated, particularly in the capital city of Port of Spain and Woodbrook, etc., we're going to be surprised by what we find out about them. One person I want to highlight today, which is going to be, I'm sure it's going to be a shocker for most, is Woodford. Woodford is one of the most celebrated, openly glorified historical figures in this country. He was the longest serving British governor. He has what you call it, the Woodford Square, streets, cafes. He has a life-size monument in the Anglican Cathedral. He has another one in the Catholic Cathedral downtown. Woodford was the greatest white supremacist in the history of this country. And the actions that he took during his time as governor of Trinidad reverberate in our society today. There's a piece of history which I'm sure you're not familiar with, where 700 Trinidadians left this country in 1854. That is a couple of decades after Woodford's rule, led by a man called Numa Dioceses, who was a wealthy, propertied entrepreneur in this country. And he left a note. And in that note, he said it was impossible for somebody with one drop of black blood to find any happiness in this country. And so 700 colored people, and that is people who would have been considered white today, left this country because of the legacy of Governor Woodford, the legacy which included the segregation of churches and schools, which continued well into the 20th century. A lot of people don't realize that. That is Woodford's legacy. Woodford encouraged whites to be exceedingly harsh with people of color. And there are stories from his time in office where people were literally beaten in the streets. And so any society, and I want to say that what is also interesting about when you do the research into Woodford is that people stood up against Woodford. People stood up and sacrificed their lives to try to move the society forward. And there's one brother in particular, a man called Francis de Ritter, the first colored priest in this country, Catholic priest in this country. He took on Woodford and the hierarchy of his own church and set up his own Catholic church and Catholic school, where Rosary Boys and Rosary Church is today, in that very same spot. And it was the first desegregated school, the first desegregated church in the country. What kind of country are we when we celebrate the man who tried to promote segregation in our schools and our churches with streets, etc., cafes, plazas, etc., and the man who set up the first desegregated school and desegregated church, we forget about him. What kind of people are we? You know? And so
we didn't forget about him. We have not taught about him at all. Because I mean,
no, there's a reason we haven't been taught about him. The colonials felt that they needed us to celebrate. Woodford Square wasn't named after Woodford while he was alive. 100 years after he was dead, somebody said, this is the man we need to revere. We need to put this man in front of the people of Trinidad and Tobago so they could be inspired by his vision and his ideas and so on. And they named the place Woodford Square. They could have chosen at that time, if their value system was in keeping with the one we proclaim today, every creed and race find an equal place, to honor Francis de Ritter. Why hasn't the church up to today? This is another good question. Why hasn't the church gone and found their own priest who stood up against Woodford? Why are both churches still honoring Woodford inside with as I said, a life-size monument in the Anglican Church and another marble monument in the Catholic Cathedral? These are all interesting questions that are going to come.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that because it may be considered a controversial question, but how much should the committee be considering the indoctrination of religious groups when the conversation continues in this regard? Because part of what the colonization was eradicating African religion. The Hinduism came with the indentured workers, so it largely maintained to a significant level. But there are many who suggest that some of the larger religious denominations also played a part in colonization, not necessarily maybe in always in terms of islands, but certainly in terms of erasing a particular history, the accuracy of the history, and replacing it with Catholicism.
Yeah, well, I don't want us to overstep the bounds of the work that needs to be done here. I mean, there are all kinds of, when we talk about the history, we can get involved in all kinds of subjects, but I think we need to stay focused here on the people and values that are celebrated in our public places. And certainly we would want the religious bodies to operate in this historical moment right now, today, in support of, to stand on the right side of history with the rest of the population in this country and to help us to move forward.
Well, I mentioned it because you mentioned the fact that the churches did not celebrate the person who championed desegregation in schools. Interestingly enough.
Yeah, well, I mean, well, the thing about it is that Derrida would have founded what he would call, what some historians call a renegade Catholic church. And what Rosary Boys and Rosary churches today, which sits out on the land, I'm not sure that the church ever paid for that land from the Derrida family. I think he was persecuted to death by Woodford. He was on his way to the Vatican when he died to see if he could get the support of the hierarchy of the church to address the kinds of white supremacist activities that he was so disturbed about that Woodford was committed in Trinidad. And then sometime a few decades after his death, his school and church were demolished on that property on Park Street, and the church took that property and then built Rosary Boys and Rosary School. There should at least be, for the least, a clear acknowledgement of the historical significance of that particular building and that structure. But there's so many more stories like this that are going to come to the fore when you get into the history. And this is why it's such a tragedy that we who have done this work for so long, who have done this research, who have this information, are not would not be invited to such a committee.
Well, I know enough about politics that know that nothing happens by guess. Is reparation beyond the remit of this committee, you think, the conversation on reparation?
Well, this conversation is certainly related to the conversation on reparations. How can you ask for a country for reparations and continue to celebrate the icons of the crime against humanity that you're asking for reparations for? How can you openly glorify enslavers like Picton and others, and at the same time pretend that you're interested in getting reparations for the crimes they committed against your ancestors? Something is incongruent. There's a contradiction there. And so, of course, the two things are related. There's also the fact that, as I said, these monuments are part of the epistemic violence of colonialism. And they are the reason, that is part of the structure that what Bob Marley talked about, mental slavery, that mentally enslaved people in such a way that many of them, if you were to offer them reparations, they might refuse because the story that they've been told about their past is so false that they don't think anybody has anything to compensate them for. So these are all, these things are all related.
Are you willing to quote?
Yeah, and I'm going to ask him that actually.
And so we can open the phone lines. How much of this is important in terms of reversing the developmental issues we face in the country generally?
Well, again, I think that these things are connected. So one of the big issues that we have right now in the Caribbean is crime. And, if we step back and look at the crime issue, we would recognize that this is not a local issue. There are about 8 countries from the English-speaking Caribbean that are among the most, that are in that top 20 countries with the highest homicide rates in the world. We talk about police violence in the United States of America. There are historians in Trinidad who argue that the rate of police killings in Trinidad per capita might be higher than the United States of America. That is extrajudicial killing by the police. All these things are related to our history, the people and values that we proclaim in our public spaces. They're all connected. When we begin to understand our past, we begin to understand why the Caribbean is in such a mess. And then we could, according to Frantz Fanon, we could find the exact measure of the actions that we must take to liberate our future. You have to retrace the lines of colonial violence to understand the exact measure of the actions that you must take to free your future. So I'll just give you a very small example, right? When we think of hairstyles for children going to school and for people going to work, we think we know what's best. We don't realize that the ideas that we think through come through a colonial prism, a prism of colonial violence. And so we have a situation where in this country, boys like Richard, if Richard and yourself, Paul, if you were going to school, you might sit next to an Indian person or somebody racialized as white, and they would be able to have hair going down to their shoulders. But your teacher would come to you from the time your hair got to about a centimeter long and ask you to cut it because your hair was unkempt and unneat, and nobody would object. That kind of discrimination is rife in our society.
Well, I have a personal issue with a nephew of mine who went through that at a prestige school 4 years ago, where he decided he was 14 years old, coming into his own, sense of identity forming, and decided to grow his hair, and his mother plaited his hair, and the teacher said, "You can't come in the school like that," and it got to the principal. And I asked, well, why are the other boys in the school of East Indian descent allowed to grow their hair to their shoulders? And he said, it's a matter of neatness. So are you saying African hair is unneat in its natural state? And the conversation ended, and he said, he can grow his hair, because the mindset was that because his hair was natural African hair, plaited, growing down, that there was an objection.
Yeah. Paul, let me say this.
We do have a call, gentlemen, so I want to grab it. He's been holding for a while. Good morning.
Good morning. I just tuning. I don't know if the gentleman can answer this question. I would like to know what Gandhi's statue is doing in San Fernando. Why was it put there? What happened that it's on the promenade in San Fernando? Gandhi's statue.
All right. Thank you.
Well, any statue that is put up by any particular group of people will be put up because they believe that it represents their values, that person is somebody that they want to encourage the society to emulate. Of course, there's some controversy over Gandhi statues recently because of his actions and utterances in South Africa. So some statues of Gandhi on the continent of Africa have been removed, but in the context of the Caribbean, he is still viewed through the lens of his anti-colonial activity, which is very real and very profound.
All right. You was going to say something before we do that call, Shabaka.
About something the hairstyle thing is superficial, but it's not.
Yeah, I just want to point out.
It was a value system. It was the value of everybody is equal.
Yeah, just to go back to the point that I'm making, that you have to retrace the lines of colonial violence to find the exact measure of the actions that you must take to free your future. So anywhere colonialism went, including on the continent of Africa, African hair was criminalized. So today we are having this conversation in Trinidad. They're having the same conversation in South Africa, in Nigeria, in other countries on the southeastern part of the continent. Everywhere that colonialism went, every single thing about the native that was natural to the native, the food that they ate, the color of their skin, the texture of their hair, the color of their eyes, the way that they walk, the clothes that they wore, everything was criminalized. And when you become independent, you have to begin to engage in a critical conversation on the values that you inherit from colonialism. And that's what this project is really about. And in doing so, you can discover the kinds of measures you need to take to protect your people from the continuation of colonial violence. And let me just say, just to make the point really clearly, again, in 1962, when we achieved independence, or the opportunity to give substance and form to independence, because it's not an end in itself, but a beginning. For the vast majority of people across the Caribbean, 80% were functionally illiterate. Only thereafter did we then unwittingly expanded colonial epistemic violence in our efforts to try to create citizens that were pillars of these new democracies that we were creating. We went around building schools to universalize literacy, but unwittingly we took the content of a colonial curricula and expanded its reach. In other words, we are responsible for our own mental enslavement in the Caribbean. The colonials didn't invest enough money and resources in the education system to fully achieve that while they were in power. We did it for them when we took over accidentally. And we're going to have to come to terms with that as we go into the future.
All right, let's take this call. Good morning.
Hi, good morning, gentlemen.
Morning.
Good morning. Now, I appreciate, applaud what it is that you are seeing, given a historical perspective of what occurred and the need to change, to amend the history itself, right? My problem is that this form of communication only happens around Emancipation Day, but at least it's disseminated to the public among the Emancipation Day. And there seems to be a disconnect when it is that you have persons external to the African diaspora seem to be attacking the family home. And there seems to be a silence on the Emancipation Support Committee. And I was hoping that probably get your perspective as to persons who communicate on Emancipation Day speech and tend to associate the African or persons of African heritage and affiliation with only about land.
With what? Sorry, I didn't hear the
land, right? And not recognition of our accomplishment in terms of education, medicine, and what role we played. Now, the history needs to be taught in the schools because Trinidad is replete with history in terms of slave revolts. We don't know about these names of these individuals. The identity is not created. So the African youth and them do not have an identity or appreciation of what has happened and the milestone that we contribute to Trinidad and Tobago, right? So there needs to be greater communication from the Emancipation Support Committee and persons of yourself who representing that form of history and recognition and show us, explain to us the Masters and Servants Act and how that impacted upon the persons of African heritage in terms of accumulating wealth. Right? Thank you very much.
Thank you, caller.
Let me see if I can answer the parts of the question that I got. So first of all, Emancipation Day, the celebration was deliberately set up as an institution to sit alongside the education system and the church, etc., other institutions that we felt that were underserving the people where education was concerned. That's how it was deliberately set up. The extent to which it has been effective in terms of its work is the extent to which it has been resourced and it has been resourceful in its work. But the intention has always been to set up an institution that would sit alongside and critique the work of the institutions that would have had so much of their DNA constructed in the colonial period. And so it's not surprising to me that you would find that information like this would come out around emancipation time. And of course, we would all want that type of work to continue year round. But again, you have an opportunity now for an organization like the People's National Movement to set up a committee, and people who, like myself, who are pioneering this work are not invited to sit on the committee. That tells you something about the strain that people in civil society have to suffer, who have declared a dividend of energy on behalf of the people. It's not something that comes with any reward. It's not something that is acknowledged. In fact, the work that you find yourself working in opposition to the powers that be very often. So that's important for people to note. What was the other aspect of the question? I didn't get all of it there. Oh, I just want to mention, he talked about family. Going back to Woodford again, one of the things that Woodford did was he discouraged marriage among people of color in this country. We talk about all these single family homes, and the relationship between that and the period of colonialism. Well, Woodford was there as a pillar. He made it very difficult for people of color to get married and to have properly constituted families. He was a major part of that. And of course, we're going to look critically at him over the next few months. And if the committee doesn't decide that he must go, we're definitely going to raise that as an issue. So I think that's what I could get from that question. I hope I answered it adequately.
Yeah. Well, time has crept up on us, Shabaka, because so we'll have to end the interview at this point. So I don't know if you have any ending words that you'd like to say before we close off the interview.
Yeah, well, I think that one of the things we're going to have to do over the next month is to educate people specifically about Picton, because again, the Queen's collection has been, the Royal collection has been modified for the crimes committed in Trinidad. You had the Heroes Gallery in Wales, in Cardiff City Hall. His statue was removed there because of the crimes he committed in Trinidad. And of course, the Museum of Wales has also removed his portrait. And Trinidadians need to know why these things were done. I also want to quickly remind people that this work is not new. Some of our greatest intellectuals, and I think that is the question that I missed from the caller, that we tend to focus when I deal with the authorities and they say, okay, Shabaka, if you want to move this, what should we put there? They tend to want to focus on somebody involved in the culture. They don't want to acknowledge the people who sacrificed their lives for the freedoms we enjoy today. That's going to be another battle that we're going to have to face after removal and so on. We're going to have to look at the people that we actually pull out of our own history to put in front of our children. And so that's going to be another important factor. But we do have great thinkers. There's the great Jan Carew from Guyana said that these false heroes that we celebrate and honor, and he spoke specifically about Columbus. He said they don't only blight or burden our history, but they burden our character as well. The great Frantz Fanon from Martinique said, and I'm going to leave you with this quote: "Imperialism leaves behind germs of rot, which we must clinically detect and remove, not just from our land, but from our minds as well." Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Shabaka Kambon. And that's where we'll end the interview this morning. And of course, the conversation will continue as the committee does its work. And I'm sure there's going to be a lot of conversation concerning whatever decisions they make, because Trinidad is that kind of space where everybody has an opinion and it's going to be echoed across social media for sure. So I'm sure we'll have you back, Shabaka, to see how it all plays out.
It's always a pleasure to be with you guys here on this program, my friend. Take care.
All right, Shabaka, thank you so much. All the best to you. Have a great one.
Okay.
All right, of course, that was Shabaka Kambon. Let's get into our news. Of course, Evie is in, and your news.